Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to today's program, and happy holidays to everyone. We have 2 weeks left in our annual year-end giving campaign. You know, we're a very small nonprofit, and we depend upon the support of our viewers to raise money to cover our operations and the cost of these live stream productions. We're almost to our goal, but not quite. So if you would please stay tuned to the end of the live stream to find out how you can contribute and get us over the line to where we need to have raised the money. My staff and I greatly appreciate your support, and we thank you so very much. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, with politics professor Dan Schnur. Dan, I think you've done almost 35 politics in the time of coronavirus since March, and you have such a phenomenal following, and we wouldn't have gotten through this crazy political environment without your help. So thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Kim. I can't believe we've been doing this for 9 months now. I have to admit, when we first talked about this, I thought it's something we'd do for a few weeks before the world opened up again. So that's why I don't like to make predictions as part of the webinar.
Well, we're so grateful. Dan has agreed to come back and continue politics in the time of coronavirus next year, beginning January 7th. So you'll be able to register for his events and continue this fabulous discussion. So we're so appreciative of that. But today, Dan, we've got 3 terrific topics that you're going to help us with. The United States of COVID, the new outbreak and the path forward. Secondly, Biden's top priorities and challenges in the Middle East. And third, the post-Trump politics. Can the 2 parties work together? That's a lot to digest today. But I'll turn it over to you so we can have as much time with you as we can. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Kim. And as always, thanks to all of you for joining this conversation each week. It really has been a wonderful experience for me, and I've been very flattered by many of the emails I've gotten from several of you, as well as the feedback we get each week when you fill out the survey. I also want to take a moment, and we'll see Jessica later, but I also want to mention both Claire and Jessica for the tremendous work they've done on this program over the course of the semester. Oh my gosh, this is a professor slip up, over the course of the year. But I do want to echo Kim's appeal. Kim and Jessica and Claire and the entire team at the World Affairs Council Town Hall do such amazing work. And I hope you would encourage making an end of the year donation so that we can do even more of this in 2021. As Kim mentioned, we do have 3 fairly complicated topics today. The challenges of COVID going forward, the challenges in the Middle East for the new administration going forward, and the prospects for bipartisanship between the new administration and Congress going forward. And we certainly won't be able to cover any of the 3 in the depth and detail that they deserve today. But I suspect that all 3 of these topics will be coming up fairly regularly over the course of 2021. So as we normally do, let's dig in, cover as much as we can, knowing that this is a conversation that's going to continue for weeks, for months, and for years to come. So let's start by talking about the United States of COVID. And I begin that aspect of the conversation by noting that this past Monday, December 14th, was a remarkable day, not just in American politics, but in American history. And we experienced 2 extraordinary milestones. One was the Electoral College officially voting to declare Joe Biden as the country's 46th president. And also, as we'll talk about for a few more minutes today, the first coronavirus vaccines beginning to arrive at hospitals and healthcare facilities across the country. Now, the first thing we should acknowledge is a cautionary note, is that there's a very, very big difference between a vaccine and a vaccination. The fact that we have now achieved and acquired a pharmaceutical remedy that provides medical protection against the coronavirus. So that does exist, and that's incredible. And the fact that it has now begun to be distributed is really is wonderful for all of us. That said, that's the vaccine, that's the medicine. The vaccination, now that the vaccine exists, means getting it into the arms of hundreds of millions of Americans and of billions of people around the world. This is going to be the largest logistical mobilization in our nation's history, perhaps in world history. And that mobilization effort, which is absolutely unprecedented, is still necessary to get that vaccine into the arms and the veins of the people who need it. Even before we talk about the logistical challenge of distributing the vaccine, it's worth talking for a moment about the challenge of persuasion. Not that much more than half of Americans say they're willing to take the vaccine right now. Most of the resistors say that they want to wait and see how it goes before they decide whether to take it or not. But there's a decent sized percentage of the population of our country who said that they will not take the vaccine under any circumstances. And we tend to see those greatest skeptics, those most notable resistors, in rural communities, in African American and Latino populations, and among those without a college education. So there's a lot of people in this country who need to be convinced to take the virus. And so what I'd like to do right now before we go on is to ask you your opinion. Claire, if you can put up the first question. What percentage of the American people do you think ultimately will agree to take the vaccine when it becomes available to them? Almost all, which we'll define as 90% or more. 75 to 90%, which as I understand us, gets us in the realm of safety. And that if we reach those percentages and those thresholds, that most of us will be safe, even if there are still some outliers. How about most, more than half, 50 to 75%? And fourth, our last option is less than half. What do we have for responses, Claire? Well, this is a measured audience, I would say, today. Only 3% say almost all of us will take the vaccine. 46%, almost half, think that we'll achieve that herd threshold, 46%. Little more than half think we'll fall short of that, which means the task ahead of us is a considerable one to convince people, particularly among the skeptics that I just mentioned, that it is something not only good for their own health and safety, but for all of ours as well. And I am reassured that only 1% of you think that less than half of the population will take it. That might not be the numbers that we're going to need ultimately, but let's agree that's a pretty good start. So first comes persuasion. After that come challenges of transport, of storage, of distribution. And like I said a moment ago, this is something that has never been attempted before. So we think we know how to do this, but we don't know because it is unprecedented. Now we're already seeing that some of the large drugstore chains like CVS and Walmart taking a critical and central role in the distribution process. In many communities, the National Guard in 50 states around the country will play an important role in making sure that the vaccine is available to those who need it the most. But that mass mobilization effort, the training, this coordination is on a scale that we've never seen or experienced before. And there are going to be glitches. And I think one of the most important things for us as we move into this new phase of dealing with COVID-19 is knowing that even with the vaccine in hand, and even with what appears to be a fairly considered distribution process, there are going to be problems. We've already seen a couple of small issues arise in the Bay Area, which were quickly addressed. But as we go forward, as is the case with any large-scale challenge, know that while there'll be steps forward, there will be obstacles along the way, and it's something that we're going to have to steel ourselves for going forward. To me, the most important challenge, though, well, I don't know if more important is fair because the persuasion and the distribution is pretty important too. But the third challenge I wanted to talk about is prioritization. In other words, setting up a hierarchy, if you will, to decide who is going to get the virus, who's going to get the vaccine when. Now, as all of you know from following the news, this is a months-long process. It's probably going to be next summer or even fall before all of us have had access to the vaccine. Already, healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals are coming first. They're beginning to receive the vaccine, and with any luck, that part of the process will be complete or almost complete by the end of the calendar year. After that come nursing home residents and workers. But then who? Because there are so many essential, critical members of society who really need and who really deserve the virus for all sorts of different reasons. Claire, why don't we get the thoughts of our group here on who they think ought to be prioritized once we've taken care of health providers and nursing homes? I realize this is an incomplete list. There's probably a dozen or more other groups of our fellow Americans who ought to be considered for high priority distribution and vaccination. But let's take a look at this list. Teachers, police and firefighters, seniors and those with pre-existing medical conditions, agriculture and food workers. And then finally, low-income workers, those who can't work from home, who make up some of our most essential workers. So who do you think ought to come next? And I don't think we have the capability, unfortunately, to give you the chance to rank all of these 1 to 5. But just in watching you, seeing the results of what you've decided, I think this is a really intriguing set of responses, and it marks a discussion and a debate that we'll be having in this country for the next months to come. So those with pre-existing medical conditions and those older Americans, it appears, are the first choice for our group, 35%, a little bit over 1/3. 27% say teachers, and I'll be the first to say that elementary school and high school teachers need to come first, but I hope college professors get included in there at some point, even if it's far down the line. 22% understand the importance of providing that kind of this type of vaccine to low-income and essential workers, as I said a moment ago, those who can't work from home. And then fewer of us say police and firefighters or agricultural and food workers, which doesn't mean that they're not deserving. But ultimately, every one of us had to make a choice out of these 5. And it appears that those 2 groups receive just a little bit less attention than the others. So while all this is going on, Congress is still debating a COVID relief legislative package. The good news is that Congress appears to finally be closing in on another round of coronavirus relief, and it's something that they believe that they'll be able to wrap up over the weekend. The deal's for about $900 billion in spending, which would be the largest aid package ever passed by the United States Congress, except for the CARE package, which passed earlier this year. $900 billion in spending, including direct stimulus payments for about $600 per individual, increased unemployment benefits, and money for vaccine distribution, schools, and small business, among other things. But let's face it, while that is prospective good news, assuming this does come through, much of the economic damage from congressional inaction is already done. The package is not perfect. It does provide necessary aid, but it's probably not that different from what they could have passed in April or May or June or through the summer and fall. We should recognize that the pace of jobs coming back from the 22 million jobs that were lost last spring, the pace has dropped dramatically, and it's potentially heading to 0 this month. No job increases. Weekly initial jobless claims are rising quickly. Retail sales and household incomes are down. This is the U-shaped recovery that was being discussed in the spring. You may remember that the talk back then was a lot about a V-shaped recovery, one in which it would be a very short economic downturn followed by a very rapid economic regeneration. And we're looking at something a little bit longer term now, not exclusively, but primarily because the aid package, which could have been of so much help to so many people, has been delayed for so many months. We'll talk more about this in 2021, but if we do see a slower and more sluggish recovery, like the type that we saw after the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, it's worth remembering the political ramifications that arose from that very slow and sluggish recovery. That's when Occupy Wall Street emerged on the left, when the Tea Party emerged on the right. And you could make a case that both the Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders presidential candidacies were fueled by the emotions that came out of the crisis. And don't get me wrong, the relief package is very good news. It's just 8 months late. And the cash infusion to households will definitely help. And the small business aid will help a lot of struggling businesses survive. The other potential good news is that it's very possible that the private sector, with a significant effort, with a significant boost, I should say, giving credit where credit's due from the Trump administration's warp speed vaccine development effort, if those vaccines get distributed along the timeline that's being talked about, that could be of real help to the economy. If we're back towards something approximating normal by next summer, a real end to COVID-19 sometime next year could lead to a boom in consumer confidence. It could unleash pent-up demand for dining out, for restaurants, for travel, and for all sorts of other types of commercial activity. Because while we've been stuck at home, unlike in most previous recessions, American savings rates have been going up considerably. But as I said, Congress could have done this a long time ago. And most of us who follow such things, most of us will reflexively blame the other party, whether it's Democrat or Republican. But I think we ought to agree that on this one, there's plenty of blame on both sides of the aisle to go around. Let's move on and talk for a few minutes about Biden in the Middle East. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a topic we'll be coming back to over and over again throughout next year because it's of such critical importance, not just to the Biden administration, but to the country and to the world. There are dozens of moving parts to consider when you begin to look at the broader geopolitical challenges of the Middle East. But there's three today that I want to point to and focus on of particular import. Iran, number one. Number two, the emerging alliance between Israel and the Gulf states. And number three, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All three are critically important, and all three are very closely interrelated. So let's talk about Iran first. Biden has promised to resurrect the nuclear agreement between Iran and the United States and our allies, in which Iran would promise to forego further development of nuclear weapons in exchange for a wide array of economic support. It's not going to be easy, though. Biden has said that he wants to do it. The Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, gave a speech yesterday on national television in Iran saying that he felt there was no doubt that the U.S. will rejoin agreement. But as is the case with many of these types of things, the devil is in the details. And some of those details are going to be pretty hard to reconcile. Iran wants all economic sanctions that have been imposed over the last 4 years removed immediately. They want all the sanctions gone before any further negotiations take place or before they begin to roll back on some of the advancements they've made on the nuclear front since 2017. Biden, on the other hand, has made it very clear that he believes the sanctions on Iran, the economic sanctions, should come off after the negotiations, when the agreement is actually being implemented. And that's a big hurdle. Biden has also indicated he does want to address non-nuclear weapons, missiles, and terrorism issues in these discussions. Iran says no changes. They want to go back to the agreement as it was signed under the Obama administration. The recent death of Iran's leading nuclear expert and other tensions have increased pressure from hardliners in both countries not to restart the talks. And so both Biden and Rouhani are going to be facing a lot of heat from those in their country, in their respective countries, not to go forward. Here's the bottom line on Biden and Iran. If this is something that Joe Biden wants badly, if this is a real priority for him, he'll get it. It's going to take a while. It's not going to be easy, but if it's something that's a real priority for him, he will get it. But if it's only something that Biden sort of wants, would like to get, but isn't an absolute necessity, then it probably won't happen. So Claire, let's ask our group what they think the likelihood of a new nuclear agreement with Iran is under our incoming president. Do you think the U.S. and Iran will be able to work out those differences that I just mentioned and come to an agreement, as the presidents of both countries have indicated? Or do you think that those obstacles are too high and that the world has changed too much over the last 4 years for us to be able to get back to that type of situation? Let's see what we get from our group. Wow, this is an optimistic group. 83% believe that Biden will achieve a new nuclear agreement with Iran. Only 17% say no. And what that tells me, given the point that I was making just a minute ago, is that many of us, many of you believe that it's not just something that Biden might like to do, but it's something that he really will make one of his top priorities. Let's move on now to the relationship between Israel and the Gulf states. So for years, Israel has quietly cooperated with several countries on the Persian Gulf, primarily in terms of security and military issues, but in other ways as well. And that's mainly because of the mutual animosity they hold toward Iran. In the last few months, the Trump administration has helped to make some of those relationships official as part of what's become known as the Abraham Accords. But even if it's just making official relationships that already existed in years past, this has been a historic breakthrough. And it appears that it will be one of very few Trump foreign policy initiatives that Biden will try to continue and try to expand. The big question, as it relates to the Abraham Accords, as it relates to Israel's relationship with the Gulf states, is Saudi Arabia. The big question is whether Saudi Arabia at some point will join the Accords. Now, I will say this. It is almost impossible to believe that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and the other countries who have joined so far would have done so if Saudi Arabia had objected. And the Saudis and the Israelis have had very quiet relationships and coordination over the years. But if Saudi Arabia is willing to make this relationship public and official, that represents a huge breakthrough in the Middle East and would recommend a very significant breakthrough for the Biden administration. Can that happen? Well, it probably has less to do with U.S. or Israeli diplomatic efforts and may have more to do with how concerned Saudi Arabia is about Iran. In other words, if Saudi Arabia thinks that Iran is becoming a greater and greater threat, their concern might lead them to join the agreement the Abraham Accords officially. If they are not as concerned, then they probably don't join. But what do you think? If Saudi Arabia joins the Abraham Accords, that is the potential to remake the Middle East if Israel and the Saudis form an official diplomatic and security relationship. What do you think the likelihood is of that happening? And we'll say arbitrarily over the next 4 years between now and the 2024 elections. Do we have results yet, Claire? Also an optimistic group on this one too. More than 2/3, 69%, do believe the Saudis will join the Accords. And what I'll offer to you now, and we can talk more about it in the new year, is I would argue to you that if Iran and the US re-enter a nuclear agreement like we talked about in the previous section, in my mind, that increases the likelihood that Saudi Arabia decides it wants to make its relationship with Israel official. Because as all of you know, both the Saudis and the Israelis vociferously opposed the nuclear agreement from the beginning, and both applauded very strongly when the Trump administration decided to pull out. If Biden does rework that deal with Iran, then Saudi Arabia and Israel are going to feel more threatened, and the likelihood of an official diplomatic relationship between them almost certainly grows. So finally, let's go on to our third topic. Let's talk about post-Trump politics. Can the two parties work together? And while my guess is we'll be talking about this in some way or other almost every week through next year and probably in the years ahead, as long as this particular webinar continues. But here's a few thoughts to consider as we prepare for 2021 and the swearing in of a new president. As I've talked to you about before, Biden and the Republicans will not work together on everything. They're not even going to work together on most things. The question is whether they can work together on some things if they can find common ground in a few policy areas to improve a relationship to a degree that is much better than we saw between Trump and Congress, but frankly, better than we saw between Obama and George W. Bush in their administrations as well. There are some prospects for legitimate bipartisan efforts. Most notably is infrastructure and the potential for economic growth, that roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, larger scale broadband use, that those type of construction projects and the economic growth that they would engender are the types of things on which Biden and Republicans could find ways to work together. On China policy, as we've talked about in this webinar many times, the animosity and suspicions toward China have grown in both parties to the point where Biden is likely to fashion some type of bipartisan approach on those challenges. Third, I'd mention clean energy investment. And while many Republicans are not nearly willing to be nearly as aggressive in taking on climate change on other fronts as Democrats are, investing in alternative energies, further investment in solar, wind, and other so-called green technologies are the types of things where the two parties have a chance to work together. And of course, the prospect of additional COVID relief in the months ahead. So that's where they could work together. The question is, will they? Well, that's completely up to Joe Biden and to Mitch McConnell. The two of them worked together in the Obama administration when Biden was vice president and McConnell then is now was majority leader. But they've both been around long enough to remember from their early time in Washington when even bitter partisans could find ways to work together when necessary. And whether you happen to vote for Joe Biden or not, I think it is worth noting that he brings to this office a level of experience that not only Donald Trump did not have, of course, but neither Barack Obama or George W. Bush did as well. It's worth remembering that Barack Obama had only been a senator for a very short time before becoming president. George W. Bush had served as governor of the deep red state of Texas. Neither of them had any prior experience in their political years to forging bipartisan connections when it was necessary. Biden does know how to do that. McConnell does as well. I don't know whether they will or not. As you've learned by now, I don't like to make predictions, but I think the potential certainly exists for it. Many of you will point out, and rightfully so, that when Barack Obama was elected president, Mitch McConnell made it clear in public that his top priority was denying Obama a second term. But there's a difference here. McConnell and other Republican leaders always felt that Obama was very condescending and very dismissive of them. And while that may sound somewhat childish, personal relationships are the way work gets done in politics and business or in any other sector. So the fact that Biden, having spent those years in the Senate and having come to appreciate the benefits of strong interpersonal relationships, might be able to approach leading Republicans in a different way than Obama did, makes me somewhat optimistic that this is something they can do working together. Now, obviously, much of this relies on which party controls the Senate. And we'll be talking in January, of course, about those critical Georgia runoff elections. But whether Republicans or Democrats are in the majority, even if Democrats do take 50 seats and have a working majority with Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker, even if Biden has a majority in the Senate, he still won't have every Democratic vote on every issue. And even if Republicans maintain the majority, McConnell won't be able to hold every Republican senator on every vote. So as we saw in the COVID negotiations, over the next 2 years, you're going to see centrists like Democrat Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, and Republicans like Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska taking on outsized importance. And for those of you like me who think that politics has become overly and unnecessarily partisan and polarized over the years, think of this as a resurgence of a centrist bloc in the Senate that might actually be able to help the kind of bipartisan progress that I was talking about a moment ago. Now, that's not to say that the Georgia races don't matter. Of course they do. They're of immense import. And as all of you know, those runoffs are on Tuesday, January 5th. The following day, Wednesday, January 6th, will be Trump's last stand when Congress meets to confirm the Electoral College results. And on the day after that, Thursday, January 7th, we'll have our first webinar, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, in which we'll talk about the events of Georgia, the events of the congressional approval of the Electoral College vote, and we'll be able to start a new year 2021 with no shortage of topics to take us forward. So right now, if Jessica is willing to join me, we'll spend the rest of this program doing my best to address your questions. But in case we forget to mention at the end, know that we'll be back on Thursday, January 7th, with no doubt lots and lots to talk about.
Definitely. We've got a lot to talk about now. Our first question, the media has been diligent in reporting the number of lawsuits filed on behalf of Trump's contesting the election and their subsequent loss or dismissal. Regarding California Attorney General Becerra, the media regularly references his filing of over 100 lawsuits against the Trump administration as one of his major accomplishments in office. However, there appears to be no reporting on the outcomes. How did he do?
Becerra and other Democratic attorneys general were very successful in their lawsuits. They certainly didn't win by the margins that we've seen in the post-election lawsuits. But his one-loss record and the record of his colleagues around the country is very positive. It's interesting that already the Republican Senate has mentioned Becerra as one of the few cabinet nominees with whom they might have some trouble. They don't mention the lawsuits. They believe that he's extremely liberal on issues that are important to them, relating to health, relating to abortion, and other key topics. Unless some type of scandal emerges, it's unlikely that he will not become Secretary of Health and Human Services. But it does look like that might be one of the more high-profile debates once the Biden cabinet begins to move toward confirmation.
Our next question is, would paying people to get vaccinated work instead of a bailout plan?
Well, that's a fascinating question. Simply giving people cash money to get vaccinated, I suspect it would help, but I'm enough of an optimist to think that the right type of persuasion effort could boost the numbers up to safer levels than we're currently seeing. As some of you may have read, Vice President Pence is going to be vaccinated tomorrow on television. And next week, the president-elect, Joe Biden, is going to be vaccinated in public as well. But I'll offer you this. I did some polling this year with a coalition of community groups, the Los Angeles Urban League, an organization called CAUSE, which is an acronym for Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment, and an organization called HOPE, which stands for Hispanos Organized for Political Equality. We did a bunch of polls throughout the year on a range of subjects, on race relations, on discrimination, and certainly on COVID and other topics as well. And when we asked who voters found to be the most credible messengers on the coronavirus, politicians ranked pretty low. And we've touched on this just a little bit before. And Jessica, you'd have to remind me whether we've talked about it in our webinar or in the post-game show that we do with the members who sign up every couple weeks. But to me, if you want to boost those numbers, in addition to Joe Biden and Mike Pence being vaccinated publicly, we ought to see LeBron James get vaccinated in public. We ought to see actors and singers and entertainers and athletes who can speak to a whole range of different communities, rural and urban America, voters from communities of color, young people, older people, those with or without college educations, in enlisting not just political leaders, but others who helped shape our popular culture. Just as during World War II, no shortage of Hollywood actors found ways to volunteer to promote volunteerism in the war effort. I suspect that raising awareness and raising willingness to participate on the vaccine is something that we could look to non-political figures to help us with, to get those numbers where they need to be.
I did see Sir Ian McKellen got his vaccine this morning. So if Gandalf the Grey can get it, then hopefully that will inspire more people to do so as well.
Well, I would say Gandalf is a great start, but given the demographics we need to reach, we probably need to go to a bunch of country western and hip hop singers who I've never heard of, and a bunch of TikTok contributors, the ones who are always getting in trouble at the Hollywood house parties, and see if they might be willing to post some videos for other young people that this is the right and responsible thing to do.
Go viral getting a vaccine. I like it.
Yeah.
Can you comment on the unlikely alliance between Republican Senator Josh Hawley and Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders to push for a COVID relief check for Americans before Christmas? It's a nice holiday story coming out of DC.
Well, it's a fascinating example of bipartisanship, although a different type of bipartisanship than the type that we're normally used to seeing in politics. Normally, when we think of the two parties working together, we think of those members closest to the center on their respective sides. People like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski for the Republicans. People like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema for the Democrats. But Sanders, one of the most progressive members of the Senate, and Hawley, one of the most conservative, might not share a great deal ideologically, but both are grassroots populists. I mentioned a little bit earlier that after the economic downturn of the latter part of the previous decade, 2008, 2009, we saw populist movements arise from both the left and the right, the Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party movements. Sanders and Hawley represent those populist sentiments, real distrust and real anger toward politics, toward politicians, toward the so-called establishment and elite. And while they don't share a great deal on a left-right political spectrum, the voters who are most motivated by them share that animosity toward the establishment. And so the type of bipartisanship we saw to get direct stimulus relief into the package, I think, is one of the dynamics that we might see lead to further bipartisan action in the future. It's something we haven't seen a lot of before, but in a post-Trump era, you may see more and more very conservative Republicans and very, very liberal Democrats acting together, not as ideologues, but as populists on behalf of a range of grassroots policy goals.
Right. Should AOC and the squad refuse to vote for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker if she won't consider some of their priorities, including Medicare for all, something many want, especially during a global pandemic?
I think it would be very harmful, not just to Pelosi personally, but harmful to the Democratic Party and harmful to most progressive goals if Pelosi were not reconfirmed as Speaker. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has said publicly in the last week or so that she believes that new leaders do need to be developed to take over for Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn, all in their 80s, in the near future. And she was very clear in blaming them for not doing more to cultivate the next generation of leadership. But she made it clear that she did not think that she was the person to take that job. And it appears that that type of challenge is probably not going to happen in the immediate, given that the Democratic majority in the House is so tiny, losing even a few votes could cause all sorts of problems for the Speaker and for the party. So I suspect that right now they'll offer warning shots of the type that AOC just has, but probably wouldn't move in that direction more aggressively until the end of this next session of Congress, when Pelosi has indicated she may be ready to step down anyway.
Another question on AOC is that some on the left, notably AOC, have suggested that bipartisan work is not worth pursuing. Will this hamper Biden?
It may. We talked, earlier in today's webinar about the challenges that Biden would have in convincing Republicans to cooperate. But I think the questioner is exactly right, that he's going to face a very great challenge, perhaps an equally great challenge, in convincing progressives of his own party that the brand of bipartisanship on which he ran for president is the course to follow. A lot of leading liberal voices in the party, both in Congress and outside, essentially agreed to keep their mouths shut during the campaign in the interest of winning. They've now agreed to keep relatively quiet through January 5th in order to maximize the chances of Democrats winning those 2 Senate seats. But that's not going to last forever. And the very difficult path for Biden to walk is the more he reaches out to Republicans to work on a bipartisan basis, the more he potentially alienates or at the very least demoralizes his party's liberal base. And the more time and effort he spends to try to assuage their concerns, the less likely it is that Republicans will work with him. It's a very fine line to walk. It's not an easy one. Ultimately, the message, perhaps not from Biden, but from some of his more trusted emissaries to the left wing of the party, is to try to convince those progressives that the perfect cannot be the enemy of the good. Biden talked about himself all year as a transitional president. And if he's able to convince the leading progressives in his party that his transition could lead to a more aggressive agenda in his aftermath, then he might be able to keep them in line. If they don't buy it, it's going to be a lot harder.
This next questioner says this is an off-listed topic, but I would be interested in Dan's view on the resignation of AG Barr, both the resignation itself, but even more importantly, the timing. Was it because Trump was suggesting doing something so outrageous that Barr felt he just couldn't stay in office?
I suspect so. And although the questioner, did make clear that this was not something that had to do with one of our 3 topics, I hope all of you know that on these webinars, Jessica and I are more than happy to address questions on topics other than the 3 that we picked. The broader the discussion is, I think the more valuable it is for all of us, certainly for me. So I do think that Barr resigned because he was worried that Trump would ask him to do something that he believed was untenable. We don't know what that is. Maybe it's an unprecedented large scale of pardons. Maybe it's challenges to the election results that Barr did not think was appropriate. I don't want to sound alarmist, and I do think it's unlikely, but many of Trump's supporters have urged him to call for martial law and to call for a new election. Like I said, I think that is unlikely, but Barr, whether it's something that extreme or other legal steps that he considered to be beyond the pale, was very clear that he did not want to be in the position of either implementing the president's orders or putting the president in a position where he publicly pushed back. So we don't know what the specifics are, but the supposition of the question in my mind is the right one, that Barr believed, either knowing or speculating, that Trump was going to ask him to do something in the final weeks of this administration that Barr did not feel comfortable doing. It's worth remembering that while Barr has taken any number of steps, and some very controversial steps, that have redounded to Trump's benefit, he was a relevant player in Republican politics for many, many years before Donald Trump. And my own belief is that he is more of an institutionalist than a Trumpist. And so while that worked to Trump's benefit over the last year plus, that when it comes to the kind of questions that may have caused him to step down, he realized that he would no longer be representing the best interests, not of the president, but of the presidency. And that's what caused him to step aside. So I do agree with the questioner.
Thank you. This next question is, how damaging are the Abraham Accords to this two-state solution to the Palestinian situation? In my opinion, the only viable and morally just solution.
Oh, great question. And I should apologize because I skipped over talking about the Israeli-Palestinian challenge in the interests of getting to questions from all of you a little bit sooner. But when I began the conversation about the Middle East, I mentioned about how all three of those topics, Iran, the Abraham Accords, and the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, how interwoven they were. And it's important to recognize that even while these countries have been signing diplomatic agreements with Israel, they have not lowered their voice at all on their criticism of Israel's handling of their relationship with the Palestinians. So I actually would argue that the Abraham Accords, the fact that we have a number of Gulf states publicly and officially aligning with Israel, I think that increases the likelihood of a two-state solution, because pressuring Israel as an ally as opposed to as an adversary is much more likely to yield the beneficial results. And while Israel's natural instinct, at least among many of its government leaders, would not be to pursue the type of two-state solution that Ariel Sharon called for back in his day, they're going to realize, they probably already realized, but they're going to recognize to an even greater degree the value of relationships with these Gulf states. And I think that does create an added impetus to bring them back to the negotiating table. So I don't think it's a negative toward a two-state solution. I think it's an added pressure point toward it.
And just as a sort of a plug for an event that we have coming up in January, we're screening a film called The Human Factor, which is looking back at the last 25 years of trying to negotiate that peace agreement. That'll be a screening for our members only, but we'll also be doing a Q&A with the filmmakers that is open to everybody. So we'll be sending that announcement out later today, so you guys can kind of get some background on all of this and bring us into the present.
That'll be fascinating.
Yeah, it's a great film. All right, how does Turkey figure in the calculations of the Middle East and NATO for President Biden?
Turkey is a wild card, and it's a very, very difficult one. The US worked very hard under both Trump and Obama to keep Turkey from strengthening its relationships with Russia to the degree that it has. And the fact that Turkey is now acquiring large amounts of Russian military equipment creates all sorts of security concerns. Turkey has been a very virulent voice against Israel in the Middle East, and becomes an additional complicating factor there. And of course, resolving a better but long way from settled situation in Syria requires cooperation of Turkey as well. I suspect that Erdogan is going to find dealing with Biden to be much more difficult than it was with Trump. The question that I can't answer is whether some tough love will convince the Turkish leadership to be more cooperative, as opposed to the more collegial relationship that Trump tried to pursue with them. But in the Middle East, among many, many other fronts, Turkey is one of the new administration's greatest foreign policy challenges, and the fact that it doesn't get as much attention as some of those that we've been talking about in recent weeks doesn't mean it's any less important.
Thank you. At this moment, how are we doing in Georgia?
Well, at the risk of paraphrasing Bill Clinton, it depends on what the definition of "we" is. There is new polling out just this morning that shows that both Senate races, are within the margin of error. And what's interesting there is that David Perdue's lead over John Ossoff is slightly smaller than it was a week or so ago. But at least according to this one poll, and as we've learned over the course of this past year, it's best to view these polls collectively rather than individually. But at least according to this newest poll, Loeffler has a very slight lead over Warnock, where previous polling showed Warnock with a slight advantage. But the short version is both are too close to call, both are within the margin of error, and both, as we've discussed before, are going to come down almost entirely to which party is more effective at turning out their base. there are no undecided voters left in the state of Georgia. There just aren't. And if the Democrats do a better job of motivating progressive voters in the city of Atlanta and more moderate Democratic voters in the city's suburbs turn out, then they'll win. If the Republicans are able to motivate their vote, primarily from small town and rural Georgia, then they will. But the polling, I suspect, will continue to stay close all the way to Election Day. And because, as we have talked about before many times, because polls aren't that good at predicting turnout, we're all going to watch the polls because we can't help ourselves, but they're probably not going to tell us all that much about which side is more motivated, more excited. And with any luck, we'll find out on the night of January 5th. But it's entirely likely it could be days afterwards if one or both of those races are very close.
This next questioner says, it may be a morbid question, but what happens if a successful presidential candidate should pass away before the Electoral College vote takes place? Who would the Electoral College vote for? Second place finisher, vice president of successful party?
Jeff Greenfield, the longtime television commentator on PBS, CNN, and the broadcast networks, actually wrote a novel about this many, many years ago, which, speaking of morbid, is actually a very, very funny book about what happens under those circumstances. But what I've learned, not just from Jeff's book, but from reading nonfiction on the subject, is at that point, it would be up to the electors to decide for themselves, amongst themselves, whether to do the most likely thing, which would be to nominate the vice president-elect as president, or to look for another alternative. It's important to remember the way the Electoral College works. There's two sets of electors in every state, and the candidate that gets more popular vote, as we all know, that individual's electors are designated to represent the state for the final Electoral College count. We'll take a hypothetical. If a Republican candidate in 2024 was elected president and passed away before the Electoral College met, then her running mate, I suspect, barring something very, very unusual, would be the individual to whom the electors would change. And I suspect there'd be immense pressure from the National Party organization and from the party's congressional leaders for the electors to support the running mate. Obviously, we're past that circumstance in 2020, but had something tragic happened to Joe Biden before this past Monday, it's worth assuming that the Democratic National Committee and congressional leadership would have made it very clear to the electors that they felt that the vice president-elect Kamala Harris received their votes for president, but the electors themselves would not have been under any obligation to do so. If they had decided amongst themselves instead to cast their votes for Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they'd be free to. But because most electors are party loyalists of either the Democratic or the Republican Party, that's how they get picked for the role, it's worth assuming that most of them, if not all of them, would adhere to the direction of their party's other leaders.
Interesting. We received about 5 questions asking about the recent cyber attack on the US government agencies. So can you comment on that and talk about the possible political implications of those hacks?
Well, this is one of those topics that is so complicated that it's easy not to pay very much attention to. And that would be a mistake here. Because as the questioner correctly points out, it means that one of our country's greatest adversaries has been able to penetrate some of our most sensitive computer systems. As we talked about last week, Biden is going to approach Vladimir Putin in a much, much different way than Donald Trump did. Trump has argued in public that he felt that a better relationship with Putin would be more likely to get Russia to cooperate with us. In this case, that obviously did not turn out to be the outcome. And so my guess is that Biden and his Secretary of State designate, Tony Blinken, are going to be issuing very forceful and very angry messaging at the Russians of the type that Russia has not heard from the United States in the last 4 years. Is that enough to get Russia to stop? Probably not. Though it means an enhanced focus on shoring up our cyber defense systems. But it also means, as has been the case in so many other international challenges the country faces, increases the importance of multilateralism. In a US versus Russia argument, it's very difficult to make much progress. But the more other countries concerned about the security of their own cyber networks decide to join that conversation, the more likely it is to get to a better outcome. And it's very likely that that Europe, Asia, Latin America, any other number of countries are equally concerned about the safety of their computer systems as we are about ours. And so addressing this in a more collective way rather than an individualistic way might be a better opportunity for progress.
Great. And this will be my final question, and I love this question. I wouldn't ask you for a prediction, but rather your wild guess as to what Trump will be doing in 2024. Will he still be wearing a MAGA hat, holding rallies, in court or jail, running again, still feared by the GOP, or resting quietly in a gold-plated, Twitter-free nursing home on a remote Caribbean island?
Asking for a prediction. Asking for a prediction and dressing it up as a wild guess really doesn't change the nature of the question. I think all the options sound fascinating and all of them are entirely plausible. But I'd offer you this, that think about Trump's path forward in a binary way, and that is whether he runs for president again. It's been reported that he has not yet decided whether he'll run for president, but recognizes the benefits, no matter what he does, in encouraging the speculation. So let's assume that speculation is going to continue and that he's going to continue to foster it for the foreseeable future. My guess, and it is a wild guess, is that what we learned about Trump this fall is something that I think we already knew, but now we got to see for sure. Trump doesn't like losing. And to me, the single biggest determinant on whether he runs for president again or not is if he thinks he can win. And if he doesn't think he can win, then he will retreat to a conservative media platform, a One America Network, a Newsmax, that sort of thing, and continue to stir his supporters, probably not to the same degree as when he's president, but with an influential voice. But if in a couple of years he thinks that he would hold a reasonable chance at reclaiming the presidency, then it's entirely possible that we could see him enter the race again. And I think it's a perfectly appropriate way for us to wind up this year, Jessica, because we can end it where I begun, by reminding people that I don't like to make predictions, particularly about Donald Trump. The last prediction I made about Donald Trump was 4 years, 1 month, 2 weeks, and 2 days ago, and that'll be the last one. But I do think, and one of the things we'll talk about in the months ahead, is what the Republican Party does in a post-Trump era. And to the extent that many Republican grassroots voters continue to follow him once he's out of office. And there's no way to answer those questions today. But like everything else that we've discussed today and through the months, I'll be very, very excited to talk about with all of you in what's going to be a fascinating and hopefully much, much better 2021. We've made it through a lot this year. And this has been a difficult time for, not just for our country, but for the world. And I can't speak for all of you who sign in each week. But for me, having the chance to get together with a group of very smart and concerned citizens to talk through these challenges has made this difficult year much, much easier for me. So thank you very much for being part of our conversations. And we hope that you join us when we continue them again next year.
Yeah, I would echo that, Dan. And thank you for being with us every week of this entire crazy lockdown. And thank you to all the audience members and for bearing with me as well, because I was usually the one handing the speakers microphones, not being the one speaking so much. So thank you for bearing with me through this. And yeah, it's been wonderful. And I wish you guys all very, very happy holidays. And I can't wait to see you next year, hopefully in person, but happy to be on with you guys this way for now. So I'll turn this back over to Kim. Thanks.
Jessica, you've been terrific, and Claire as well. Everybody jumped in immediately and learned all this new technology, and so we hope that you're all enjoying this. Dan, again, this was a terrific program to conclude the year on, and we can't wait. I don't know if we're going to go through a withdrawal over the next 2 weeks without another politics in the time of coronavirus before January 7th, but we'll wait with great anticipation for this to resume next year. As I mentioned earlier, we are in the very last weeks of our annual fundraising campaign, which is so critical for us keeping everything going next year. We're just a wee bit short of our goal. So if you can give, we would greatly appreciate anything you can contribute. Please text the name Schnur to the number on the screen and help us continue to be able to provide you with this quality programming. We have a terrific lineup. As we said, January 7th, Dan's going to kick the year off for us with politics in the time of coronavirus. We also will be announcing a special program with Bill Gates, showcasing his new book that's out on climate change. We should get that out on our website probably tomorrow, so stay tuned, and that will be first comes first serve, so please register early. Check out our website. There's a great lineup already posted for January. Everybody, happy holidays, and we hope to see you soon. Dan, best holidays, and thank you again so very much.